Woodwork Geek back here again. This week we're making a wooden box, and the inside of the wooden box will hold a Faraday cage. Purpose of the Faraday cage is to prevent the keys from transmitting the signals that enable the car to be opened remotely, therefore stopping the kind of car amplification attacks for car thieves. The box is made out of oak and walnut, so we start off with a bit of French oak that I'd left over from a previous project. I'm just planing it down, and here you can see me doing my first kind of draw out in terms of how to get a continuous grain pattern. So in essence, you mark the board out with 20 centimeters and 10 centimeters in terms of the sides, and then you resaw it down the middle, and the middle line becomes the outside of the box. So at that point the grain is as close to continuous as you can possibly get. It'll become clearer as we go through, but this is me just drawing out on that board kind of dimensions just to see what sizes look about right and where I would put splines and stuff, which I do a little bit later on the box. Yeah, I'm just trimming the wood down a little bit more. You can see the knots in the wood, and a close-up shot of planing the edge of the timber, so you can see that jet planer giving a nice smooth surface across, and the thick knotty wood, which you'll see me in a minute clean up. So the plan for this was to get the most figured piece of wood as I possibly could, and then fill the knots and imperfections with some black resin, so glass class 3 resin. I use this with the shimmer black onyx powders. So here it is, clearing up the knots, just trying to get out the loose fibres and just make it so the resin can fall in as easy as possible, really. So I'm using a mixture of chisels and Stanley knives and whatever's really the easiest to get those bits out. Once they're tidied up, I put some packing tape. So I find packing tape to be really good as a kind of barrier for resin. Here I am mixing the resin up. It's a 2-to-1 ratio. And I mixed up way too much. As always with resin, it's a fine line. You don't want to mix up not enough and have to mix another batch and get a different colour, but at the same time, resin's expensive, so you don't want to be throwing it away either. Here I am after it's cured, so this is a day later, just removing the packing tape and getting ready to trim down the oak. At this point I'm setting up and trying to find the most accurate way to make the cuts, the 45s. So I don't do a lot of box making at home, so I use this as a kind of test piece to try and find out which angles gave the best cut finish to give or which machines gave the best cut finish to get the 45 angles for the corners. It was about this point I felt a little bit uncomfortable with the table saw being used for those kind of cuts. It was just asking for kickback and a world of pain. So you'll see in a little bit I make up a dedicated jig for getting 45s and accurate 45s on the table saw using a sliding kind of sled. But in essence, these worked quite well. They showed me that I could get decent 45 joints. So I used this as a test to kind of mock up, just to make sure that when I put the internal Faraday cage in, it would actually work out before I'd kind of committed to using the expensive wood. And it worked quite well. Strangely enough, I think the thickness of that wood had something to do with it, because later when I tried the same method, the tin foil that I used for the first test did not actually work with the thinner walled boxes that I made in the end. But you live and you learn. So here I'm just using a router sled to cut down all the resin off the top, and then I use the drum sander just to get it kind of flat to then enable me to make the kind of sides. Here you can see me marking the edges, so in essence it's split down the middle and you have the 4 sides. So I've re-sawn the timber at this point. I must have missed the bandsaw cut. In essence it's cut through, so you can see it's book matched, so you can see that nice clear pattern, and here you can see the cut edges that you need in order to get that continuous grain, with the inside in essence being the outside of the box as you turn it. So it comes out quite well. Here's the jig I was talking about earlier. So I didn't feel comfortable with the table saw. My fingers were going to get chopped or I was going to get kicked back. So safety first. So just a bit of melamine with a hardwood runner in the mitre slot, and then I put a backstop on. You can see me here just making sure it's dead 45 so that all the joints work out exactly on the box. So test cut and then a engineering square just to make sure. And you see here I can just line it up with that edge, and it makes it much easier to ensure that you're getting tight, correct joints. So this, yeah, for me in my garage, this is definitely the way it works. Here I'm just putting a little rebate on the bottom, so I can just put a bottom on the box when I glue it up. So when I glued this up, I used a edge band and clamps, but to try and prevent glue squeeze out all over the place on the inside of the box, I sanded, which I saved you from, but then I used kind of frog tape on all the joints just to make sure that any squeeze out of glue didn't stain the inside of that box. In the end I ended up kind of putting an insert in the box anyway, so it was kind of not needed so much because it was, I put a copper insert, but at this time I thought I was just wrapping it in foil, so it was going to be a visible surface. But you live and you learn. Here I'm making the top and the bottom for the box, so just thinning them down so that they're in proportion to the box. Invaluable piece of kit, that drum sander. I don't know what I did before I got that. Yeah, I'm just removing all the tape, cleaning it up, flattening the edges, and there's the bottom going in the box. Just trying to get the best possible fit here. Rinse and repeat, cut, trim, fit, cut, trim, fit, trim. I'm trying to get that box so that it fits nice and tight, but it's not going to force the edge out. So just cleaning up the rebates, making sure it works, and just trimming it up on the mitre saw off camera. So yeah, just get that in. Eventually it gets in, so it's a perfect fit. So just rebate off the edge of the bottom of the box so it drops in. And there's me doing the top. And so in the end, the top I put a bit of walnut. So this is me just mitering some little bits of walnut to do as an edging strip for around the top, just to give it some visual definition. So I've just got them back to back there to make sure I make the piece the right size. Here I am just gluing up those edges to make it look a little bit more visually interesting. Here's a spline cutting jig I made. So I made it for this project. It's literally just a few offcuts of melamine. If I did it again, I wouldn't use melamine. Gluing melamine together is not the easiest. Melamine isn't a particularly good glue surface, so if I made another one I would just make it out of MDF on its own. Here I'm using the drum sander just to squeak the kind of splines down to an exact size so that I can fit them in. Here I am gluing the bottom on, gluing the splines in. The box is really starting to look quite special at this point. The walnut accents in the splines and the top of the cover or lid of the box are really distinctive, and the resin in the knots is beginning to pop. It's had a quick sand, but I'd go for a lot more sanding further on. Just clearing up the glue from the splines here, just try and not get too much all over the place. It's always easier to get the glue off when it's wet than it is after it's dried. Here I'm just trimming down the top, so I run that through the drum sander just to get it flat so those edges are all in line, and then I glue the box to the lid to the box. Cut the splines off. Use a flush cutting saw for that, so the teeth are only mark on one direction. Very handy bit of kit. Here I'm making a base, so I trimmed up a bit of walnut, and then I put a dome on one corner of the walnut. In the end I didn't use it, it didn't match the rest of the box. All the box has got square, straight edges, and the dome chamfer edge, or not chamfer, the dome edge on the walnut was kind of in contrast to the rest of the box. So I'll keep that on the shelf. It'll come in handy for another project if I never use it. Here's that band clamp again. This is a really handy tool for getting even clamping pressure across a box. One of those tools you never really knew you needed until you got it, and then you couldn't live without it. Here I'm just gluing the box on, the lid on the box, and just sanding all the edges flush, and it's really starting to look something special. So I'm very happy with this. And here I kind of find that my table saw is not quite as good as I'd like it to be. In essence, the insert was protruding up just a fraction of a millimetre, which kicked off the side, so the sanding of these edges turned into a much more involved process than it needed to be. In essence, what you're trying to do there is to cut most of the way through the wood, but not all the way, so it holds its rigidity, and then you just cut a wafer. Here's attempt number one. So this is where things started going a bit bandy. So this is really thick foil. So in essence, I make a box to sit within the box out of the foil. So I overlap all the corners with folds, as you can see there. And then I kind of overlap it again so that there's a double layer all the way around that box. So about this point, I'm kind of thinking I'm quids in and I'm almost there. I just need to make the foil pretty with a wooden insert or something, and then I'm kind of done. So not long after this, I stuck my car keys in my pocket and tried my car, which has got remote start, only to be a little disappointed little Bonnie when it did not work. So yeah, attempt number one here. So as you can see, attempt number one didn't work, as at that point I realised the box still wasn't quite flat, so I made up a better sanding station to rub the box down so that it was flat, and then reflattened the lid and the box to get them so that that joint was nice and tight. I think if I did it again, I would cut the lid on the bandsaw. I just get a much thinner joint. What I did find is with the kind of 2.8 kerf of the saw, the grain doesn't quite match. So here's attempt number two. So this was a bit of steel, or stainless steel, that I got from a leftover job. It equally didn't work. So attempt number one and attempt number two were both dismal failures, unfortunately. But it took quite some time trying to clean up this steel and get this steel so it was a real tight fit in that box. But when I went to solder it up, unfortunately I couldn't get the solder to stick for love nor money. I don't have welding gear, but I asked Dad. He tried brazing it and welding it, and neither worked on it. So in the end, all those hours cutting that down were wasted. It was bin fodder. But you live and you learn. Attempt number 3 is coming up, so that was copper. So I knew I could solder copper together. What I didn't know is how expensive sheet copper is. So enough copper to do that little box ended up costing me 26 quid, which was way above what I was expecting. Still, it's got to work. Only problem is it didn't work. So that was 26 quid. But yeah, attempt number 3. Here's the copper now, so it's all protected in a foil sheet. So again, I did the same routine, cut it all down, made it fit, sanded it, got it so that it was all a nice tight fit. I cut the edge off the copper. I then tinned all the copper, and then I used a soldering iron and a blowtorch to get a good seal across all of the corners, and it mostly worked, to be fair. The only problem I had is that the top of the box wasn't sealed. So if you can imagine the cube, the top of that cube, or the bit that's at the top now, was open. So there was a slight crack in terms of the Faraday cage. And what I found was if the box was in a certain position in the car, then the car would still sense the key was there. So it probably trapped 90% of the signal, but 90 is not good enough. So after soldering all this up and finding out that this didn't work, I then turned to technology. So you can actually get a fabric that has got RFID blocking in it. So it's got like a woven metal within that fabric. I Amazoned that came the next day, and what I ended up doing was overlapping the copper join at the top with a bit of that fabric, which then created a seal and got it to work. I guess the motto of this story is don't give in, don't give up. 4 attempts it took, but it was worth it in the end. In hindsight, next time round, I wouldn't bother with a copper. I would just use the RFID blocking fabric and kind of glue that to the inside of the box, and then probably do another wooden insert like I did on this one. But you have to learn the hard way sometimes. It was all worth it in the end. I don't regret it. It's just kind of nice sometimes not to have to learn such expensive lessons. You can probably tell from looking at this, I'm not a metalwork guy. My soldering and tinning leaves a lot to be desired, so do not use this as an example of the best way to make a box. I would say this is functional at best, but you never get better at anything unless you try. So I gave it a go. I learned this isn't my forte. I'm much better manipulating wood and getting wood to look pretty than I am metal. That box does look good though. Those knots are really popping, and the way that grain goes around all 4 sides of the box, really interesting. That's what I love about wood. You can take something that doesn't look that good, or most people wouldn't really be interested in using, and you can turn it into something that has massive visual appeal. I find that fascinating. Here you can see some of that silver fabric. So that silver fabric is the RFID stuff. So what I'm doing here is just kind of taping up the outside of the box. I use some spray adhesive, permanent adhesive. I then put it down and fold the corners round. Use a scraper to get it against the edge, and then trim that fabric back with a brand spanking new Stanley blade. And then we're up to the last stage. So this is the point where the maker's mark comes. So I measure out on the bottom of the box, spin up the branding iron, heat it up, and then emboss the logo on the box. And finally we have the glamour shots. Here is the box in all its glory. I have tested the box on 2 cars now and it works faultlessly. I have to say, if you're doing your own box or you're trying to copy this, just make sure you test it. I wouldn't want you to make something like this and assume it does work. If my 4 attempts are anything to go by, it's not quite as easy as it looks, but I think you'll agree with me. Actually, this security box for cars looks a damn sight better than the little pouches or plastic covered ones you can get from Amazon. I'm absolutely pleased as punch with how it came out. Hopefully you like the video. If you do, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, I'll do some more. If you don't, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Either way, I'll be happy to get input. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed watching. See you on the next one.